All right, we come now to Daniel chapter 4. Again, Daniel is continually, astoundingly intriguing as we go from chapter to chapter. What an amazing story. God is miraculous, and He's a term that I've been thinking of with Him the last few years is He is infinitely creative. And it makes me think that maybe I shouldn't pray with all the things that I want to happen. Lord, please do this and please do this, because my imaginations, the things that I think need to be done, often, or possibly even in the way that I think they need to be done, are so astoundingly simple compared to what I see God could do with every situation. Again, with snowflakes, if they say that possibly every snowflake is unique from another snowflake. I think if God can make every single snowflake unique, I think that He isn't bound to work out events in each person's life exactly the same way. Therefore, it kind of makes me excited to see how God will work something out if I just turn things over to His infinite creativity by faith. We come now to Daniel chapter 4, and we see 37 verses here. There are 4 arresting sights in this. First, there's a king cowering in his bedroom. That's kind of odd. A king cowering in his bedroom. He had been jerked suddenly awake by his nightmares. Then we see a king crowing on a rooftop. He puffed out his chest as he considered Babylon and crowed out in his glories. Then there was a king crawling on all fours, thinking that he was one of the beasts. And lastly, a king contrite upon his throne, uplifting God. Just like a rooster who he woke up every morning to crow in the morning, and he was just sure that the reason the sun came up every single day was out of just sincere admiration for the beauty of his ability to crow. I mean, he just knew that that's why the sun rose every day. Here we kind of have a glimpse of Nebuchadnezzar and the foolishness of man's pride. So we come to the introduction first of all, verses 1 through 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and language that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God had wrought toward me. How great are His signs, and how mighty are His wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and His dominion is from generation to generation. I kind of smile here. It's almost as if he says, to everyone under my power. Well, I guess that's just about to everyone. I have to tell you, I learned a valuable lesson, and let me tell you all about it. Of course, this lesson that he's going to share with us in chapter 4 here, God took these words and placed them in His Word, thus making them deathless and eternal. The message was now able to go much farther than Nebuchadnezzar would have been able to send it. He thought it good, it was beautiful before him to tell others. And of course, so that's a good thing for us as well. In Psalm 107 verse 2, where it says, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. He says, peace be multiplied unto you. It almost sounds like the beginning of a Pauline epistle. This was the very man who ground nations into dust before his experience in chapter 4. Here he's preaching peace. This idea of peace multiplied, we saw this before his day in Genesis 43:23, Joseph speaking to his brothers. We see it later on in this book, Daniel 6:25, where Darius says this to all the peoples. And then at the end of the New Testament, we see it again in 1 Peter 1:2, Peter speaking to his audience. We think, what a changed man. It almost reminds us of Paul in Acts chapter 9, on his way to do devastating things to Christians. And then before chapter 9 of Acts is over, he's disputing with the religious leaders in Damascus, proving that Jesus is the very Christ. We also remember in Psalm 137 how the disdain that people had for Babylon. And at the end of that chapter, where it said, happy would be that person that would see the little ones of Babylon dashed against a stone. Here, the leader, a well-earned, a well-deserved reputation, and the leader of this Babylon, we see here, peace multiplied unto you. Strange, something odd is going on. Something was definitely different about this man. Back in chapter 2, he briefly acknowledged the God of Daniel in verses 46 through 48. And then in chapter 3, he acknowledged the God of his three friends, Daniel's three friends, in verses 28 and 29. But by this point in chapter 4, he had again lapsed into self-importance. But in chapter 4, we see a genuine work of grace. Here he exalts the true and living God. Here is his third encounter with Jehovah. This probably occurred in the last 8 years of his 43-year reign, probably no later than 570 BC. Daniel and his friends would have been probably in their early 50s by this time. And this would have been about 30 years after the events of the fiery furnace. One God alone fills his vision now, the high God. He describes the works of God as how great and how mighty. Here he finally admits that as great as he was, there was one much, much greater. He calls the kingdom of God everlasting. Again, it's good to remember as you think of where you see how small we are in the universe. When you're able to, the footage that people create of here's us and then here's the earth. When you go to a planetarium and there's able to back out and back out and back out, and the earth you see is a speck there as one of the planets around the sun, and then then you back up and pretty soon the sun is a speck in the galaxy, and then the galaxy is a speck in the ocean of galaxies, and they keep backing up, and you think, boy, me personally, I'm a speck on a speck near the sun, which is a speck in this galaxy, in the arm, which is a speck in the arm of this galaxy, and then a speck of a galaxy within and you just keep backing out, and you think, how many times over am I just a speck? And then the Bible reminds us that the heavens cannot contain him. And even God himself said, do not I fill heaven and earth? How big God is. And we can't help but remind ourselves, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Boy, one God alone now fills his vision, the high God. You can almost hear him singing here. Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing his power and his love. Our shield and defender, the Ancient of Days, pavilioned in splendor and girded with praise. What is going on? Who is this Nebuchadnezzar we see giving this testimony in chapter 4? Reminds us of Psalm 145, verse 13. Thy kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. So that's the introduction in verses 1 through 3. Now, the proclamation, verses 4 through 36, the vast majority of this chapter. Now, all of us have had a nightmare. Maybe there's a monster after you, or you are stuck in a burning building, or you're falling somehow and you can't escape. You find your limbs are like lead. They can't move or are painfully slow. We awake, gripped by terror and sweaty, but then dawns over us the blessed relief that it wasn't real. However, Nebuchadnezzar woke from something in this chapter, and he was gripped by all its detail and was troubled. We see there was a dream. So the first thing I want to point out is the reception of the dream. Verses 4 through 18. He was at rest in his palace, which he had built, according to verse 30. He was enjoying a peaceful and prosperous reign. No resistance out there. So underneath the reception, I'd like to point out the king's dread. The king's dread. Verses 4 through 9. So let's read this. The king's dread. Verses 4 through 9. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Then came in the magicians and the astrologers, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, and I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubleth thee, tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. The king's dread we see. So the wise men were brought in. They heard the dream. Oh, what a relief that this time the king actually told them about the dream. But again, they couldn't tell him what it meant. And with the actual participle that's used here, it indicates that the wise men were continually unable to make known the interpretation. They weren't about to try to pull a fast one on him this time. And of course, they didn't see it. He didn't see it. And I can't help but cross-reference 1 Corinthians 2:14, where it reminds us that the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God. Even if they could guess part of the meaning, they wouldn't have wished to tell the king the ominous nature of the story it seemed to tell. And again, you might say, well, these wise men didn't seem like they were much good to him. And I don't know why. Probably political reasons to keep these men around. Maybe each one was representative of different aspects or different members of the pantheon of the gods of Babylon. I don't know, but he kept these men around and still sought their advice from time to time. It is unclear why Daniel didn't show up until later also. Maybe he had the habit of not associating himself with them as much as possible. However, it's still obvious that he's the leader, as the king made clear when he called him the master of these people. So he would have been at this post for nearly 40 years. Maybe he enjoyed saving the day after they failed. So let those guys fail, and then I can swoop in at the last second and save the day. Maybe that was his M.O. He wouldn't have had much in common with them professionally. Here the king uses Daniel's Hebrew name and then his Babylonian name, according to the name of my God. It seems to indicate that Belteshazzar was a name representative of a national deity over which the king ruled. So even though he was still married to his idols, he made a clumsy attempt to uplift Daniel and Daniel's God, then begged Daniel to make known to him the dream. He recognized that Daniel was indwelt by the Spirit of the holy gods. And it's interesting, he says, no secret troubleth thee. I like that when you think of Philippians chapter 4, where it says that the peace of God will be with you, and the God of peace will be with you. I tell you, secrets trouble us from time to time. The unknown health issues that my wife is going to face in the future. I look at my children and wonder, will I face serious health issues before they do? I don't want to watch one of them go through some. There's unknown things, but you know, when you know the Lord and you know that He knoweth everything, we can be like Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar recognized the fact that no secret troubled him. I like in Psalms where the psalmist said, the Lord heard me and delivered me out of all my fears. I tell you what, it's good to know the Lord. Then secrets don't have to trouble us because we know who holds those secrets. So with this indwelling, this word combines the preposition in with the pronoun him, suggesting divine indwelling. Now, the Old Testament saints weren't indwelt like the New Testament church age saints. They were temporarily indwelt by God when they prophesied for Him. But of course, the permanent indwelling is part of the regeneration of the New Testament saints based on the promise of the new covenant, Ezekiel 36, which Christ ratified with His shed blood on the cross, Matthew 26 through 28. New Testament saints are permanently indwelt, John 14:17. The upon ministry of the Old Testament versus the indwelling ministry of the New. As will the millennial saints in Jeremiah 31 and following. So he speaks of the spirit of the holy gods. Here Nebuchadnezzar is speaking based on his simple and limited understanding of the great God of Daniel. Knowing that something was special about him, but how quickly you forget and you lapse back into the status quo or whatever's comfortable. He had seen that there was no God like Daniel's God, but by chapter 4 here, he needs a fresh glimpse. And then this glimpse is going to forever change him. Then we see the king's description, verses 10 through 18. Let's read that. Thus were the visions of mine head upon my bed. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. Okay, so right now the wise men are thinking, ooh, that sounds like it's probably him. This would be great because he's a great tree. And the tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven. And the wise men are still rubbing their hands together. Woo-hoo-hoo, this is fun. We get to build up the king. The sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed. Of course, they're thinking, yes, yes. And behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. Okay? And he cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree. Oh man, these TV preachers, these TV evangelists, these power of positive thinking, there's these men that wanted to just tell him, send us money and everything will go well with you, are now wondering, uh-oh, how are we going to reshape this? Hew down the tree and cut off the branches and shake off its leaves and scatter the fruit and let the beasts get away from under it and the fowls from under his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. This dream I, Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. The king's description. At the beginning of the dream, everything sounded good. The wise men were probably thinking, hey, we're going to tell him this is about him. This is him. I mean, all the nations of the world. He rules and organizes and keeps everything together. So nothing menacing so far, but then the dream takes an ominous turn. A watcher comes. This is an Aramaic word. It's a noun from the word meaning to be watchful. It was a special class of angels that were apparently tasked with observing humanity. Maybe part of the guardian angels from Psalm 37:4. And so these actually came and pronounced judgment. Paul alludes to angels who watch for signs of submissive women in local church services in 1 Corinthians 11:10. Ezekiel 1:18, the angels that Ezekiel saw there had eyes round about. Sounds like they could have had a similarity with the idea of being watchers. They apparently had the duty of exalting God and humbling men. So this watcher comes, an holy one, and one of them gives a string of imperatives. Hew down the tree, cut off the branches, shake off the foliage, scatter the fruit, let the beasts and the fowls flee, leave only the stump with the roots, place a band of iron and brass around the stump. Possibly the picture to preserve it from rotting. Leave the stump in the field to be moistened with dew and left among the beasts. The Lord, in all his sovereignty, allowed these angels to participate in his work of revealing himself as the Most High, who is sovereign over all. The scriptures tell of Micaiah seeing the details of an angelic council in which the sovereign God used willing angels, even demons, to accomplish his divine will, to bring Ahab's life to an end at Ramoth Gilead in 1 Kings 22. He also used angels in the giving of the law, Acts 7, Galatians 3, Hebrews 2. He will use them in pouring out his judgments upon the earth during the tribulation, Revelation 16:1 and following. So we see these watchers, but then there's this tree, and then we see these watchers, but then suddenly there's this man that comes into focus. He is in a terrible state. He is evidently mad, horribly changed, unclothed, exposed to the elements and dwelling among beasts. His human heart has been changed to the heart of a beast. Here, heart, the words are similar in Aramaic and Hebrew. Heart in the Old Testament referred to the seat of reason. It could refer to the physical or spiritual aspect of man's constitution. King Saul, we remember, was given another heart, which could probably have referred to God's gift of a mental ability to administrate, or to be a good military leader in 1 Samuel 11. But this heart of a beast, similar to probably what we know as boanthropy, a form of monomania. We even have a disease, lycanthropy, a mental delusion, where one thinks that he's a wolf man, giving fuel to the really popular myth today of werewolves. This terrible state was going to last for 7 times, or cycles, or for 7 years. So, so Nebuchadnezzar saw this man beast, and he doesn't want to know if that's him, while wanting to know if that's him, while not wanting to know if that's him, while having to know if that's him, if you get my drift. Knowledge that you don't want to have, but you need to have. Can you see him looking at Daniel? So, this man beast, who is that? Talk about just an uncomfortable situation to be in. But Daniel he did well. Talk about 1 Peter 3:15, where it says, being ready to give an answer to every man. The first part of that verse talks about sanctifying the Lord God in your heart. But I think making sure God is who he needs to be in your heart will enable you to be ready to give an answer when somebody comes to you like this. Like that will ever happen to us. But you never know. But here's Daniel in this situation. He dreaded to have his fears confirmed, but he dreaded even more to be left in the dark about it. So number 2, next, verses 19 through 27, we see the revelation of the dream. So first of all, I'd like to point out Daniel's astonishment in verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him, I guess. The king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. Here Daniel doesn't like the dream, and kind of he's indicating here, it's I don't like it, your enemies would. Kind of to prepare his heart a little bit. His thoughts troubled him. Was he shaking his head like a mechanic staring down at my engine? You know that we laugh about the mechanic that practices in training to just get the look just right as he opens the hood of my car and looks in and, you know, Daniel, was that the look? We see here his thoughts troubled him. And again, you kind of laugh and say, well, at least you look at the wise men and you say, well, at least he has thoughts. He was apparently hesitant to tell him. Was it because he cared about the king? Was it because he feared the king? I would have no problem probably saying quite a bit of each. In either case, he was diplomatic about preparing him. Wished that the enemies had received the vision and not him. In the Bible, there's an interesting type of praying called imprecatory prayers, which were not unusual. Psalm 69, 23, and 24, and 28, and Psalm 109, 2 through 20, in which you pray misfortune or evil down upon enemies of yourself and more importantly, enemies of God. But here, Daniel was not excited about this. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't stand the tension anymore. Please, please, just tell me what I need to know. So next we see Daniel's assessment. Daniel's assessment, verses 20 through 27. Let's read that. The tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O king. Thou art grown and become strong, for thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto the heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. And whereas the king saw the watcher and an holy one coming down from heaven, and saying, Hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. That they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas he commanded to leave the stump of the roots, the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee. After that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. So Daniel's assessment. King, do you want the good news or the bad news first? It was probably a nice thing that the dream started positively. You, it is thou, he says. There's similar grammatic emphasis to when Nathan put his finger in David's face and said, thou art the man, in 2 Samuel 12:7. You are the tree that overshadoweth the whole earth, representative of the zenith of your power. We can imagine Daniel, as he approaches the end of the interpretation of the dream, choosing each word with the utmost care. He skillfully reinforces the idea that this message is from God's ministers. Like we would say, hey, shoot, don't be angry with the messenger. The message and the messenger are distinct. All right? So I'm just a mouthpiece. It's a message from one of God's ministers. By the way, and I'm sure that as he saw this watcher, he was in awe of the greatness and the grandness. But as great and grand and glorious as the watchers were, they were mere servants of the Most High God. And this message was from God through the watchers, and from the watchers through Daniel. It was from them, not the human prophet. Here he's in an Esther moment. Esther is not on the scene yet. She will be a pivotal part of the next upcoming world empire that we'll see a little bit later on in the book of Daniel. But here he is in his Esther moment. If I perish, I perish. This is the interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar would be smitten with madness. He would vacate his throne. He would be driven from men. He would imagine himself to be an ox. By the way, this word here for ox, this is the source Aramaic word for the Spanish word el toro, or the bull. Interesting etymological tidbit there. He would think himself to be an ox and would eat grass. God was not only gracious in giving him the kingdom, but in placing him in the company of the four men of faith we see in this book. Here, he's given the plan of salvation from these men. If he was burning in hell today, it wouldn't matter the least little bit to him that he, after all, was the head of gold. He had to come to the point where he realized the heavens, God, not Mother Nature or his pantheon of gods. God ruled. And I tell you, to be an animal for 7 years, but then to know salvation, it's worth it. And I tell you, I would wish it for everybody. It can't work that way, but I tell you, everyone in hell would gladly come back and give up 7 years of their life and say, would you be willing to go back to earth and have this terrible mental illness until you come to know the Lord as your Savior? What? I can do that? Oh, absolutely. It was absolutely worth it. Today, you can ask Nebuchadnezzar if those 7 years were worth it. And he'd say, what 7 years? That was so tiny compared to all the time that has elapsed between then and now. And I look at all of eternity laid out ahead of me. Absolutely no questions asked. His insanity would last for 7 years until he came to his senses. And we see that probably his son, evil Merodach, Marduk, was the temporary regent until the king's sanity returned. God said his kingdom would be sure, or the idea of enduring. So he would have to come to his senses in the deepest sense of the word until the fact dawned upon him that all of his vast empire was not his, not the result of his military genius and administrative skill at all, but God's. God had sovereignty and had given it to him and would now take it from him, but his kingdom would not be taken from him pending the restoration of his sanity. Daniel waxed bold and began to preach. Break off, literally permanently renounce thy sins. Very similar to the Hebrew word for sins, meaning the missing of the mark. By righteousness, also similar to the Hebrew word for righteousness, an external behavior to a known law. Even Nebuchadnezzar was under God's moral law. The Lord had sovereign requirements for all mankind, irrespective of government. John the Baptist was able to condemn Herod's divorce and remarriage. It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife, Mark chapter 6. He was to show mercy to the poor, James 1:27. But in his pride, of course, he wouldn't be interested in helping the poor. Pride and greed are often twins. So break off thy sins by righteousness, and then iniquities, those perversenesses when you're bent or crooked, by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. So next we see the reality of the dream, verses 28 through 36. The city of Babylon was founded by Nimrod. We see that back in Genesis chapter 10. Let me tell you a little bit about this city. Here, there was rock to build on and clay for building material. To the south was a morass that provided defense. It was placed at the point where the Euphrates, which flowed through it, became navigable. At one point, it was just a city in Assyria, but when the combined might of the Babylonians and the Medes overthrew Nineveh in 612 BC, the future of Babylon was sure. Most of what we know about Babylon comes from the ancient historian Herodotus, who saw it in all its glory. The city was basically a square, 56 miles in circumference. There was a magnificent bridge on either side and a temple dedicated to Belus and the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. The outer walls were 335 feet high and 87 feet wide. That's pretty unimaginable. The city was built in the form of a square, about 56 miles in circumference. The Euphrates, which flowed through the city, provided the city with an abundance of water. It was spanned by a spectacular bridge. In that temple, dedicated to Belus, was numerous golden idols. The wall was so wide that chariots could race side by side along these massive walls. They were matched by 100 gates of solid brass, 25 on each of the four sides of the city. A straight road ran from each gate to the opposite gate. These roads intersected each other, dividing the city into 776 squares. In the center of the city, 150 pillars, each 88 feet high, supported the chapel of Baal. Inside was a colossal golden image to Baal. It was the spectacular hanging gardens that have been hailed for centuries as one of the wonders of the world. Successive terraces rose one above another until they reached as high as the walls. They were then filled with soil and planted with every kind of tree and flower. When finished, the hanging gardens looked like a mountain verdant with luxurious gardens. They were built to please Nebuchadnezzar's consort, who came from Media and who missed the hills and mountains of her native land. Undoubtedly, the city of Babylon was magnificent. The renowned Ishtar Gate, built by Nebuchadnezzar, made lavish use of blue glazed bricks and molded relief figures of lions, bulls, and dragons for decoration. It was astounding. So first of all, underneath the reality of the dream, we see sudden confirmation in verses 28 through 33. Let's read it. 28 through 33. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, oh, how forgetful we are, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. A year went by. He was given a space to repent. We think of Jezebel, who was given a space to repent in Revelation 2:19. A year went by, and the sharp edge of the dream was forgotten. How many times do we sit in church and we tremble over a thought, and then so quickly the fear of God is taken from us as time robs us of that thing, and we don't stir up the embers of that thing that God moved us about. He caught a glimpse of Babylon. By the way, the pride of Babylon continues throughout the ages. Revelation 14:8 and 18:2. While he walked, there was some intensity in, literally upon, his palace. He began lifting himself up in the past, and he crossed right over that mysterious line between the wrath and the mercy of God. The kingdom is departed, perfect tense, already taken by the Lord. It's departed from thee. His long unkempt hair would be matted looking like feathers, and his long nails would have looked like claws. The servants probably kept him safe somewhere in possibly the royal forest for protection, the royal gardens. But secondly, underneath this we see sweet salvation, verses 34 through 35. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven. By the way, we don't take advantage of this enough. To lift up our eyes. Here for 7 years, his gaze was earthbound. And we live like it's such a wonderful thing to keep our eyes on this earth and all the pleasures it has to offer. And God reminds us to set our affection on things above. When Nebuchadnezzar came to the end of this time and looked up, he thought there's no better place to look than up. Not around at what I have done, definitely not at myself, but look up at the God of gods. I looked up unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. So these verses, coupled with the verses at the beginning of this chapter, it sounds like a man who doesn't just know how to say flowing things about God, but a man who finally knows God. And all the habitation of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand. He was the one that just a chapter ago was saying, and who is that Lord? And he realizes he forgot so quickly. None can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? It's all so clear to him. For 7 long years his eyes had been riveted to the earth. Now at last he could look heavenward in faith. He burst into praise for God. Bless, praise, honor. The heavens did indeed rule. Before him every nation was as nothing, more than a drop of a bucket, if that. Had Daniel read to him Isaiah 40 verse 17 or Isaiah 41:24, where the smallness of everything, the fact that everything is tiny and minuscule before him, Isaiah brings out. He controls the armies of heaven, and how much more the armies of men. How dare anyone question his wisdom, love, and power? The restored words of the Babylonian should be engraven with an iron pen and lead in rock forever, and placed over the portals of every throne room and every congress upon the earth, especially in times like these when terror stalks the earth and when men have within their grasp weapons of mass destruction and when men have shrugged off all fear of God. Then we see a swift restoration in verse 36. At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. He recognized that it was given to him and then taken from him and now given back to him. Majesty wasn't something that just flowed from his special, unique inner being. It was something that he had received, and he recognized that now. The kingdom was restored to him. This is an amazing miracle. How was it that a leader in that time, a different leader, didn't rise up and take charge of everything? It seemed like, humanly speaking, the perfect time for a power struggle to be unleashed. Imagine the liability it was to those who administrated the affairs of state to have a mad emperor. God said that he would preserve the kingdom for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged the ways, works, and wonders of God. Excellent majesty was added. So the conclusion, we've had capital A, capital B, and now capital C. The conclusion, verse 37, pride. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment, whose truths that and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. That was Nebuchadnezzar's crowning sin. Not greed or lust, not murder, but pride. Of course, everything else easily flows from pride, but pride was his crowning sin, the failure to acknowledge God in human affairs. Remember Lucifer, who was enthroned in heaven on high as the anointed cherub, the most gifted and glorious of all the angelic hosts. We think of Eve, who listened to the serpent, mishandling God's word, and succumbing to the dangled delusion, ye shall be as gods. Remember Herod Agrippa I in Acts 12, verses 20 through 23. Pride is the sin of sins. And Nebuchadnezzar took care of it in chapter 4. And I believe he got saved. He trusted in the scriptural God, the Son of God, by the scriptural means, faith, for the scriptural work, deliverance from sin, to receive the scriptural future, his eternal kingdom, and consequently had the scriptural experience, eternal salvation. Wow! What a chapter.